Let's talk about something most Americans have never heard of, but something that has the power to bring the most advanced military and technological machine in the world to its knees. Gallium, a soft silvery metal that you could hold in the palm of your hand, a metal so unremarkable in appearance that most people would mistake it for lead or tin. And yet, without it, there are no advanced radar systems protecting American aircraft carriers. Without it, there are no 5G networks humming across the country. Without it, the semiconductors powering your phone, your electric vehicle, your military's precision-guided weapon systems, they simply do not exist. And right now, today, in this very moment in history, China controls somewhere between 94 and 98% of the world's primary gallium production. Let that number settle for a second. Not 30%, not 50%, 94 to 98%. That is not a supply chain. That is a chokehold. And in December of 2024, Beijing closed its fist. What unfolded starting in December 2024 was not an accident, not a bureaucratic misunderstanding, and certainly not a random act of economic aggression. It was a calculated, deliberate, and surgically precise move by Beijing in what has become the defining geopolitical contest of the 21st century, the technology war between the United States and China. And the question every American should be asking right now is not just what happened, but why it happened, what it means for the future of this country, and whether the people in Washington, who are supposed to be protecting American interests, actually have any real plan to fix it. Because based on everything we know, the answer to that last question is deeply, deeply uncomfortable. On December 3rd, 2024, China's Ministry of Commerce announced stringent export restrictions on dual-use technologies specifically targeted at the United States, restrictions that went so far as to ban shipments of gallium, germanium, and antimony to the United States outright. Think about what that word means. Not a slowdown, not a reduction, a ban. These restrictions marked several firsts in the trade war. The first time Chinese critical minerals export restrictions were targeted at the United States rather than all countries, and the first time restrictions on critical minerals were a direct response to restrictions on advanced technologies. Washington had spent years poking this bear, restricting Chinese access to advanced semiconductors and chip manufacturing equipment, and Beijing finally answered. Not with tariffs, not with diplomatic protests, but with a scalpel aimed directly at the jugular of American technological dominance. Now, let's understand what gallium actually does in the real world, because this is not abstract economics. This is national security. This is the stuff that determines whether American soldiers live or die on future battlefields. Gallium is vital for light-emitting diodes and advanced military radar. Germanium is needed for fiber optic cables and the infrared sensors used in night vision goggles. Those night vision goggles that American special forces depend on in the darkness of night operations. That radar that guides American fighter jets and helps naval vessels detect incoming threats. Those fiber optic cables that form the nervous system of the entire American communications infrastructure, all of it, every single bit of it, runs through materials that, as of December 2024, China told the United States it could no longer have. The U.S. Geological Survey estimated that if China imposed a total ban on its net gallium and germanium exports, the move could result in a $3.4 billion drop in U.S. GDP, economic losses that would mostly be felt by the semiconductor manufacturing industry. But understand this clearly. That $3.4 billion figure is just the beginning number. It doesn't account for second and third order effects. It doesn't account for the cascading collapse that happens when defense contractors can't source the materials they need, when chip makers are forced to idle production lines, when the entire downstream ecosystem of American high-tech manufacturing grinds to a halt. That $3.4 billion estimate is the floor, not the ceiling. According to the U.S. Department of Energy, the United States relies on China for 95% of its gallium supply, and the report found that the United States does not have sufficient domestic resources to meet expected demands for certain critical materials such as cobalt and gallium. 95%. Let me put that in perspective for you. If someone told you that 95% of the water your city drinks comes from a single reservoir controlled by a hostile power, you would call that a national security emergency. You would demand immediate action. You would demand that heads roll in Washington. But somehow, for decades, American policymakers allowed exactly this kind of catastrophic dependence to build up across the most critical materials in modern technology, and almost nobody said a word. About 15 to 20 years ago, China took a long-term view. Beijing deliberately undercut Western producers before consolidating control of global supply. They flooded the market, made it uneconomic for others, and then locked up assets worldwide. This was not an accident. This was strategy. Patient, long-horizon Confucian strategy of the kind that Washington has always been constitutionally incapable of matching, because American political culture operates on 2-year election cycles while Beijing operates on 50-year plans. And the results of that mismatch are now painfully, embarrassingly visible for the entire world to see. China is the world's largest primary producer of all three materials. The country produces almost half of the world's antimony, 60% of its germanium, and 98% of its gallium, according to the USGS. The U.S. gets about half its supply of gallium and germanium directly from China. And the antimony situation deserves special attention here, because antimony is not just some industrial curiosity. Antimony has direct critical military applications. It is used in ammunition. It is used in aerospace alloys. It goes into the defense systems that the United States depends on to project power around the globe. The United States has no domestic antimony production and severely limited stockpiles. Since antimony export restrictions were imposed in September 2024, antimony shipments from China dropped 97%, while prices rose 200% price increase in a matter of months. That is what a weaponized supply chain looks like in real time. China's export controls, which escalated into a full embargo on U.S. shipments in December 2024, sent gallium prices through the roof. By May 2025, prices hit $687 per kilogram, over 150% above pre-control levels. That is not a market correction. That is a weaponized supply chain. Think about what that means for every company in America that manufactures products using these materials. Think about what it means for the defense contractors who have to keep producing radar systems, night vision equipment, and advanced communications gear for the United States military. Those cost increases do not disappear. They get passed on. They cascade through the entire system. And ultimately, the American taxpayer and the American soldier bear the burden. Now, Washington did not sit completely still during all of this. But what Washington did is perhaps more revealing than comforting. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that China's latest curbs are a continuing reminder of the need of the United States to have diverse and resilient supply chains for critical minerals with national security applications, and not to be reliant on any single country, especially a competitor like China. He then added that it would take at least the next decade to get America to a position where it could breathe a sigh of relief on this issue. A decade. He essentially told the American public that the people in charge had known about this vulnerability for years, that they had done insufficient work to address it, and that it was going to take 10 more years to fix. That is not a reassurance. That is a confession. Then came what appeared on the surface to be relief. China's Ministry of Commerce announced in November 2025 that it would suspend its ban on exports of gallium, germanium, antimony, and superhard materials to the United States until November 27, 2026, a move that came after a wider trade truce between the two nations following high-level talks between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. And across American boardrooms and defense procurement offices, there was an exhale. Finally, some breathing room. Finally, the materials could flow again. But anyone who read that announcement carefully understood something very important. What China did was not lift a ban. What China did was install a switch. And they kept the switch in their hands. Here's the kicker. This is not a policy reversal. It is a licensing regime. Exports to the United States are now managed under case-by-case approval requirements rather than facing outright prohibition. That is not market access. That is conditional access with an off switch. Read that again. Conditional access with an off switch. Every shipment of gallium that leaves China now requires Beijing's approval. Every single transaction involving these critical materials now passes through the filter of Chinese government decision-making. Washington thought it won a reprieve. What it actually accepted was a permanent reminder of its own vulnerability, institutionalized into a licensing framework that Beijing can tighten or suspend at will at any moment for any reason. While the ban is suspended, export licensing remains, and the military end-use ban stays active. That means Beijing retains the ability to reactivate stricter controls. Chinese media explicitly say export controls are lawful regulatory tools, not ad hoc trade weapons. That last point from Chinese state media is particularly important because it reveals the strategic framing Beijing is using. They are not presenting this as economic aggression. They are presenting it as normal, legitimate, sovereign regulatory practice. And by doing that, They are normalizing their control over these materials in the global conversation, making it much harder for Washington to frame the situation as Chinese aggression without looking like America is complaining about another country exercising its own laws on its own resources. The current suspension of China's gallium export ban creates a temporary window for continued trade while maintaining underlying control structures. This suspension period, effective from November 2025 through November 27, 2026, demonstrates the strategic use of policy timing and trade negotiations. No long-term guarantees extend beyond the November 2026 expiration date, maintaining uncertainty for supply chain planning, and that uncertainty is itself a weapon. Every American company that manufactures products using gallium, germanium, or antimony now has to make decisions under a cloud of strategic ambiguity. Do you build inventory at current prices? Do you invest in domestic alternatives, knowing they will cost far more? Do you redesign your products to reduce dependency on these materials? Every one of those decisions costs money, costs time, and diverts resources from actual innovation and production. The uncertainty itself imposes a tax on American industry. The clock is already ticking on the November 27th, 2026 expiration. What happens then? Does China extend the suspension? Do they reimpose controls? Do they introduce new conditions or expand restrictions to other materials? Nobody knows. And that uncertainty is itself a cost in hedging strategies, inventory management, and capital allocation. November 2026 is not far away. It arrives in months. And right now, there is no ironclad guarantee of what comes after it. The entire American technology and defense industrial base is being forced to operate on the kindness of a strategic competitor's grace period. That is not strength. That is not independence. That is a form of technological vassalage that should humiliate every American leader who allowed it to develop. Advanced semiconductor fabrication requires precise material specifications that are difficult to substitute. Chinese suppliers had developed specialized processing capabilities tailored to specific semiconductor manufacturing requirements, making alternative sources technically challenging and economically expensive. This is the part that the cheerleaders of decoupling never fully reckon with. It is not just about finding the raw material somewhere else. The entire processing infrastructure, the refining technology, the quality control systems, the specialized knowledge built up over decades of industrial scale production, all of that sits in China. You cannot simply point at a deposit of bauxite in Utah and declare that America will now produce its own gallium. You need the processing capacity. You need the trained workforce. You need the industrial ecosystem that makes production viable at scale. And building all of that takes years, requires billions of dollars in investment, and faces enormous economic headwinds because Chinese production will always be cheaper as long as Beijing chooses to make it so. Non-Chinese production could potentially increase by roughly 170 tons with new projects coming online, which represents approximately 24% of current global supply. Meaningful, yes, but hardly a game changer when China can still turn the tap off at will. And here is the uncomfortable reality. Access to these new supplies for United States buyers depends on evolving trade relationships. European producers will prioritize their own clean tech and defense sectors first. The United States is competing for scraps from a supply base that will not mature for another 18 to 24 months at minimum, so even the alternatives are not really alternatives yet. They are possibilities, potential, future supply that is still 18 to 24 months away from being real, and which will face its own political and economic complications when it arrives. The electric vehicle industry demonstrates significant exposure through gallium nitride power semiconductor adoption. Adoption rates increased from 5% of new EV models in 2020 to approximately 30 to 40% of new platforms by 2025 and 2026. Major manufacturers, including Tesla, Volkswagen Group, BMW, and General Motors, have incorporated gallium nitride technology to improve power conversion efficiency. This is not just about chips for computers or radar for warships anymore. This is about the direction of the entire American economy, the green energy transition, the electric vehicle revolution, the infrastructure build-out for clean energy. All of it runs through materials that China controls. If you want to understand why Beijing has been so patient and so confident in its strategic position, this is the answer. They looked at where the world was going. They saw the future, and they put themselves at the center of it 20 years ago while American policymakers were distracted by endless wars in the Middle East and squabbling over tax cuts. Despite the restoration of supply, the price levels of these three metals are expected to remain higher than pre-ban levels. One reason is that although the United States and its allies have begun building domestic production capacity, the costs of new projects far exceed those of existing Chinese supply. This is the permanent economic wound that the ban period inflicted. Even with supply flowing again, American manufacturers pay more. American defense contractors pay more. American taxpayers ultimately pay more. The baseline has shifted upward and will not come back down because the new producers entering the market cannot compete on price with Chinese production. Every month that American policymakers spent ignoring this vulnerability translated directly into higher costs that now burden the American economy going forward. The deeper truth here, the thing that should keep every serious American strategist awake at night, is that gallium, germanium, and antimony are just 3 items on a very long list. China has dominance in a much larger number of commodities than these 4 minerals. Additional export controls, including bans, are likely as tensions escalate. What we are watching with gallium is not a one-time event, it is a demonstration. Beijing is showing Washington and showing the world exactly how it intends to fight this war. Not with missiles, not with naval blockades, with materials, with the invisible sinews of modern technological civilization, with the rare earths, the critical minerals, the processing capacity, the supply chains that everything else depends on. This is the new warfare. And right now, by almost every honest measure, China is winning it. U.S. dependence on China for these minerals is a known Achilles heel. The latest development is a very blunt reminder that we, the United States, continue to be dependent. A known Achilles heel, known. That word should infuriate you. It was known. Experts wrote about it. Analysts testified about it before Congress. Reports documented it in exhaustive detail. And still, decade after decade, the dependency deepened. Still, the investments in domestic production capacity never materialized at the scale required. Still, Washington chose the cheap option, the easy option, the option that served short-term corporate profits while quietly hollowing out long-term national security. And now here we are negotiating with Beijing for temporary permission to access the materials that are supposed to be the foundation of American power. What needs to happen now is not complicated in concept, though it is enormously difficult in execution. America needs to treat critical minerals the way it treated oil in the 1970s after the Arab oil embargo as a genuine national security emergency requiring a national mobilization. It needs to fund domestic production capacity at the scale of a wartime industrial program. It needs to work with allies. Not just talk about working with allies, but actually build integrated supply chains that span friendly democracies across multiple continents. It needs to invest in recycling technology that can recover these materials from existing devices at scale. And it needs to accept that all of this will cost money and that the cost of not doing it is far, far greater. The strategic vulnerability remains. Western economies are dependent on Chinese goodwill, or at least Chinese strategic calculations, for materials critical to semiconductors, defense, telecommunications, and renewable energy. That is not a supply chain. That is a single point of failure, a single point of failure. In engineering, when you design a system with a single point of failure, you have not designed a system, you have designed a disaster waiting to happen. And right now, the most powerful, most technologically advanced nation in the history of the world has built its entire technological civilization on top of a single point of failure that sits in Beijing. That is the real story of gallium. That is the real story of what China just did. And unless America wakes up to the full depth of this challenge, not as a trade dispute, not as a tariff negotiation, but as the central strategic competition of the 21st century, the story does not end well.